In late 2025, tensions between Japan and China flared once again, this time over Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's remarks about a potential Taiwan contingency. Beijing reacted with unusually sharp rhetoric, canceling more than 900 flights scheduled for December, suspending cultural events, and even halting Japanese concerts and film screenings. Chinese state media went so far as to brand Takaichi of poisonous seed, triggering strong reactions both inside and outside China. Meanwhile, economists warn that although Japan will suffer from lost tourism and shrinking inbound consumption, China may face an even harsher boomerang effect as its already fragile economy struggles with slowing growth, overcapacity, and weakening exports. With both countries deeply intertwined through trade and tourism, and with memories of the 2010 rare earth retaliation still lingering, many now wonder, how long can China keep its fist raised? And what price will both sides pay if this standoff drags on? The deterioration of Japan-China relations in late 2025 did not come out of nowhere. It was the result of a long-simmering distrust that finally boiled over on November 7th, during a session of Japan's lower house budget committee. When Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi responded to a question from Katsuya Okada regarding a potential Taiwan conflict, she stated plainly that if China were to use warships and armed force, the situation could reasonably constitute a survival-threatening emergency for Japan, language that refers directly to the country's ability to exercise collective self-defense. For many in Tokyo, her answer was simply a logical interpretation of Japan's security laws. But in Beijing, it was treated as a strategic escalation and an ideological provocation. What truly shocked Chinese leadership was not merely the content of Takaichi's remark, but the clarity with which she delivered it. Unlike past Japanese prime ministers who preferred ambiguous language on Taiwan, Takaichi offered a concrete scenario, something Chinese officials view as crossing a red line. When she later stated during the November 26 party leaders' debate that she had simply answered faithfully within the scope of the question, Beijing saw not clarification, but defiance. This is where the political narrative hardened. China wanted a symbolic retreat, yet Takaichi signaled that backing down was not an option. The backlash came swiftly. Chinese authorities issued a recommendation urging citizens to avoid travel to Japan, which immediately led to over 900 flight cancellations scheduled for December. Cultural exchanges were also suspended, including the long-planned Japan-China-South Korea cultural ministers meeting set for late November. State-run Xinhua escalated the rhetoric, labeling Takaichi of poisonous seed, a term intended to frame her as a destabilizing force not only for Japan but for the region. Soon after, Chinese cinemas and concert organizers abruptly canceled Japanese productions, with one of the most striking moments occurring on November 28 in Shanghai, when singer Maki Atsuki's performance was forcibly halted mid-song as lights were switched off and staff ushered her off stage. The following day's event was also canceled without explanation. This kind of sweeping cultural and economic retaliation has precedent in China's diplomatic playbook, but even many Chinese citizens criticized it as excessive. Social media comments questioned why artists, tourists, and ordinary consumers should be made to carry the burden of geopolitical anger. Yet Beijing, having demanded that Takaichi withdraw her parliamentary remark, left itself with little room to maneuver. Admitting overreaction risks losing face domestically. Pressing forward risks inflicting unintended damage on China's own industries. In Japan, analysts quickly began calculating the short-term losses. China and Hong Kong together make up nearly 24% of all inbound tourists to Japan. Between January and September, around 9.22 million visitors came from China alone, spending an average of 239,000 yen per person in the July-September quarter. Given these figures, economists such as Takashi Kiuchi warned that the travel restrictions could reduce Japan's GDP by 0.29%, with broader knock-on effects in hospitality, retail, and regional economies such as Hokkaido and Okinawa. The numbers are large enough to hurt, but not large enough to bend Tokyo's political stance. Yet beneath the surface, something more structural is occurring. This confrontation has become a symbolic test of resolve for both governments. Tokyo wants to demonstrate that democratic debate cannot be externally constrained, while Beijing wants to show that challenges to its Taiwan position will always be met with forceful retaliation. Neither side can afford to appear weak at home, especially during moments of political pressure, Japan with its shifting security environment, and China with its slowing economy and rising domestic frustrations. As tensions escalated through November and December 2025, the conversation in Japan largely focused on the estimated losses from declining Chinese tourism. But a deeper, more consequential question began to surface: is China's retaliation economically sustainable at a time when its own fundamental weaknesses are becoming impossible to ignore? Many analysts argue that the answer is no, and that Beijing's punitive measures could ultimately accelerate the very decline it hopes to conceal. To understand why, we must examine the internal pressures weighing on China's economy by late 2025. The country's long relied upon engines, real estate investment, credit expansion, and export-driven manufacturing were all showing signs of structural fatigue. The property bubble had already ruptured, unemployment among young people had risen to politically sensitive levels, and export growth, the one bright spot, was beginning to cool amidst U.S. China tensions and weakening global demand. When China reported its July-September real GDP growth of 4.8%, down from 5.2% in April to June, economists interpreted the slowdown not as a seasonal fluctuation but as a sign that Beijing's 2025 growth target was at risk. In this fragile environment, China's decision to impose wide-ranging informal sanctions on Japan carried greater risks than in previous years. The flight cancellations, cultural bans, and travel advisories were intended to pressure Tokyo by targeting sectors Japan relies on heavily, such as inbound tourism. However, the blowback on China itself was equally notable. Chinese travel agencies faced a wave of cancellations that disrupted cash flow and increased operational losses. Airlines, which had anticipated a recovery in international travel, suddenly found themselves with empty planes and reduced revenue. Even domestic regions reliant on Japan-bound tourists, Hainan, Shanghai, Guangdong, saw spikes in refund claims and logistical costs. More importantly, China's export-dependent economy is deeply intertwined with Japan through sophisticated supply chains. According to the Japan External Trade Organization, JETRO, Japan exported $156.5 billion to China in 2024. While importing $167.1 billion in Chinese goods. Japan remains China's third-largest trading partner, meaning any prolonged disruption is not a symbolic gesture, it strikes directly at China's manufacturing sector, the heart of its employment and tax base. If Chinese retaliation pushes Japanese firms to scale back, diversify supply chains, or shift production to Southeast Asia, the long-term scars on China's industrial ecosystem could be permanent. On the Japanese side, companies had already begun preparing for this scenario. Over the past decade, private sector risk assessments increasingly used the term China risk, the recognition that political volatility could disrupt operations without warning. The 2025 confrontation accelerated these trends. Sectors such as electronics, automotive components, and advanced materials began reviewing their exposure profiles. Multinationals in Europe and the U.S., observing Japan's predicament, quietly reevaluated their own China concentration. Thus, China's retaliation did not merely target Japan, it inadvertently signaled to the world that economic engagement with China carries political conditionality. Beijing also faces a strategic contradiction. It wants to project strength externally, especially on the Taiwan question, while avoiding internal instability that could arise from economic weakness. But by sustaining pressure on Japan, China risks damaging precisely the industries it needs to stabilize growth, exports, manufacturing, tourism, and international services. The dilemma becomes clear: the longer China keeps its fist raised, the more forcefully it strikes its own economy. The example of rare earths, a tool China used in the 2010 Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands incident, illustrates this dynamic. China still controls about 70% of global rare earth production, and its refining capacity remains unmatched. Yet experts warn that deploying a rare earth embargo again would be self-defeating. Global supply chains have diversified since 2010, and such a move would accelerate Western investment into alternative sources, permanently eroding China's strategic advantage. Moreover, many of China's own high-tech industries rely on materials and equipment that cycle through Japanese firms. Restricting exports today could destabilize China tomorrow. Then there is public sentiment. Although nationalist rhetoric is common in Chinese state media, the abrupt halting of Japanese cultural content, especially the dramatic shutdown of Maki Atsuki's performance on November 28, sparked frustration among ordinary citizens. Many questioned why entertainment, travel, and cross-border friendships must be sacrificed for political theater. When the following day's event, November 29, was also canceled, the criticism grew louder. This internal pushback does not threaten political stability, but it does expose the limits of public patience for prolonged escalations that offer no tangible benefit to daily life. As Japan and China enter 2026 with tensions still elevated, the most important question is no longer who started the confrontation, but rather who has the capacity and the willingness to end it. Both sides now face a diplomatic stalemate shaped by political pride, economic vulnerabilities, and shifting regional alignments. In this final part, we examine the strategic calculations on each side, the potential paths forward, and the broader implications for regional stability and global markets. First, let us consider China's position. Beijing has publicly demanded that Prime Minister Takaichi retract her November 7 parliamentary remark, a demand that is fundamentally incompatible with the norms of Japan's democratic system. No Japanese leader, regardless of ideology, can retroactively erase an answer given under parliamentary questioning. This makes China's demand not only politically impossible but structurally irreconcilable. Yet Beijing's leadership, having amplified its own outrage through state media, cannot easily soften its stance without appearing to lose face domestically. The longer this symbolic demand remains on the table, the harder it becomes to resolve the dispute diplomatically. Complicating matters further is the weight of internal economic pressure. With China's July-September GDP growth slowing to 4.8% and the country simultaneously navigating the fallout of a real estate collapse, declining consumption, and weakening export orders, Beijing's capacity for prolonged confrontation is more limited than its rhetoric suggests. High-level officials surely understand that weaponizing tourism, culture, and trade against Japan is a double-edged sword. Each additional month of restrictions deepens the boomerang effect, chipping away at export earnings, logistical efficiency, and the confidence of foreign investors. And although China maintains a firm stance on Taiwan, escalating conflict with Japan, its third-largest trading partner, risks turning a political dispute into an economic crisis. Japan, for its part, is not without challenges. The losses from Chinese tourism are real and immediate. The suspension of more than 900 flights for December, the cancellation of Japanese cultural events, and the sharp decline in inbound consumption, estimated by analysts such as Kyuchi and the Japan Research Institute to range from 1.49 to 2.3 trillion yen in the coming years, carry significant consequences for Japan's hospitality industry and regional economies. Yet politically, the situation plays differently. Prime Minister Takaichi's firmness has been interpreted domestically not as provocation but as a reaffirmation of Japan's right to speak openly about national security threats. In a time of shifting public sentiment, Tokyo views backing down as far riskier than standing firm. This delicate balancing act defines the current phase of the crisis. Japan cannot concede its sovereignty over parliamentary speech. China cannot easily retract its public demand. And neither side wants to be seen as capitulating. Thus, the situation drifts into a prolonged standoff, not because of hostile intent, but because both governments are constrained by political narratives that they themselves helped create. In this context, the question becomes, what are the possible off-ramps? Historically, Japan and China have resolved similar confrontations through indirect de-escalation, such as quiet diplomatic exchanges, third-party mediation, or the rebranding of meetings and forums to allow each side to save face. Something similar could emerge here. China may gradually shift the focus from demanding a retraction to emphasizing future cooperation. Japan may offer clarifications on the legal framework of collective self-defense without modifying the original statement. These incremental steps could gradually cool tensions without a formal resolution. However, there is also the possibility of escalation. Memories of the 2010 rare earth incident still cast a long shadow. If Beijing were to impose export controls on strategic materials, or if Tokyo were to heighten security cooperation with the U.S. in response, the confrontation could evolve into a broader geopolitical struggle. Such a cycle would not only damage both economies but also destabilize global supply chains in electronics, automotive manufacturing, and clean energy technologies, sectors where Japan and China play irreplaceable roles. From a broader political perspective, the episode highlights a deeper transformation underway in East Asia. China, once confident in its economic momentum, now faces rising doubts at home and abroad. Japan, long seen as cautious in its diplomacy, is becoming more assertive as regional security threats intensify. The United States, though not openly involved in this particular dispute, watches closely, aware that Tokyo's stance on Taiwan echoes Washington's own strategic priorities. In this sense, the Japan-China standoff is not an isolated quarrel but part of a shifting geopolitical architecture in which economic leverage is increasingly intertwined with military posturing and ideological competition. For global audiences, especially older viewers who have lived through decades of Japan-China ups and downs, the current moment may feel familiar yet unsettlingly different. In past disputes, economic pragmatism often prevailed quickly. Today, however, both nations are driven by domestic political dynamics that limit flexibility. China faces economic fragility and a population weary of unpredictable restrictions. Japan faces a security environment that demands clarity, not ambiguity. These competing pressures mean that even small disputes now carry the potential to spiral into long-term strategic confrontations. Ultimately, the future of this standoff will hinge on whether both sides can recognize the mutual cost of continued escalation. The interconnectedness of their economies, reflected in more than $300 billion in annual trade, means that neither can afford to treat the other as an expendable adversary. Yet unless leaders in Tokyo and Beijing find a face-saving path back to dialogue, the consequences could radiate far beyond Asia, disrupting global markets and reshaping geopolitical alignments.